Have you ever felt that your prayer life has become just another item on your to-do list? You know that moment when you find yourself reciting familiar words with your lips, while your mind wanders to tomorrow's meetings, tonight's dinner, or that unresolved conflict with a loved one. Perhaps you've experienced that subtle emptiness that comes from going through religious motions without feeling any real connection to God. It's like standing in a beautiful cathedral, surrounded by centuries of sacred art and devotion, yet feeling like an outsider, separated by an invisible wall of routine and distraction. What if I told you that one of the greatest saints in Christian history experienced this same spiritual dryness before discovering a profound truth that would transform not just his life, but the spiritual lives of millions across centuries? Saint Ignatius of Loyola, the soldier turned mystic who founded the Jesuit order, discovered something profound about devotional practices that many of us miss in our hurried modern lives. The rosary that lies forgotten on your nightstand, or the prayer book gathering dust on your shelf, might hold the key to a spiritual awakening you never imagined possible. Many of us approach our faith like casual visitors to a magnificent museum. We acknowledge the beauty, we appreciate the history, but we remain spectators rather than participants. We keep sacred objects like rosaries as meaningful trinkets rather than instruments of profound transformation. Ignatius of Loyola understood something that our efficiency-driven culture has forgotten about: the physical aspects of devotion and their connection to spiritual awakening. Before his dramatic conversion experience while recovering from a battle wound in 1521, Ignatius began sleeping with a rosary near him. This seemingly simple act wasn't just about having a religious object close by. It represented the beginning of an embodied faith that would eventually lead to visions so powerful they would redirect the course of his life and ultimately shape the spiritual formation of countless souls across the globe. The story begins on the battlefield at Pamplona, where the young Spanish nobleman and soldier Ignatius was struck by a cannonball that shattered his leg. The injury was so severe that the doctors had to break and reset the bone multiple times, leaving him with a lifelong limp. During his long and painful recovery at his family castle, Ignatius requested romantic novels to pass the time, but none were available. Instead, he was given a life of Christ and a book about the saints. Initially, he read these religious texts simply to alleviate his boredom. But as the weeks passed, something began to stir within him. He noticed that when he fantasized about returning to his former life of military glory and romantic conquests, he felt an initial excitement that quickly faded to emptiness. But when he contemplated the lives of the saints and imagined himself following their example, he experienced a lasting peace and joy that persisted long after his reading ended. What was it about this physical connection to the rosary that prepared Ignatius for divine encounter? In our modern world, we've created artificial separations between body and soul, between physical practices and spiritual experiences. We've intellectualized faith to the point that we sometimes forget that we are embodied beings whose physical practices deeply influence our spiritual receptivity. When Ignatius began sleeping with the rosary, he was unconsciously recognizing what ancient spiritual traditions have always known: that our bodies are not obstacles to spiritual experience, but potential gateways. The rosary against his skin, the physical reminder of devotion even in sleep, began to break down the walls between his conscious religious observance and his deeper spiritual longings. This understanding runs counter to much of what we see in contemporary approaches to faith. Many Christians today have adopted a primarily cognitive approach to religion. We study, we analyze, we debate doctrines and theological positions. We treat faith as something that happens primarily in our minds. But Ignatius discovered that authentic spirituality must engage our entire being. Our intellects, yes, but also our emotions, our imagination, our physical bodies, and even our subconscious mind that continues its mysterious work even as we sleep. By keeping the rosary with him through the night, Ignatius was allowing sacred objects and intentions to permeate even his unconscious hours, creating fertile ground for the visions that would soon transform his understanding of God and purpose. Consider for a moment your own approach to faith and devotional objects. Perhaps you have a Bible that sits on your bookshelf, opened occasionally but rarely engaged with deeply. Maybe you wear a cross necklace or have religious artwork in your home that has become so familiar you hardly notice it anymore. These sacred objects, much like the rosary that Ignatius kept close during sleep, have potential beyond their material existence. They can serve as tangible connections to the divine, physical reminders that penetrate deeper than intellectual understanding alone. The question is whether we allow them to fulfill this potential, or whether they remain mere decorations or cultural artifacts in our lives. What's fascinating about Ignatius's experience is that this seemingly small devotional habit preceded the dramatic visions that would change the course of his life. While recovering from his battle wounds, after he had begun sleeping with the Rosary, Ignatius experienced a series of profound spiritual insights. He saw the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus. He perceived spiritual realities with such clarity that he later wrote that even if the scriptures did not exist to teach him, he would believe in these truths based solely on what had been revealed to him in these visions. This points to something profound about spiritual preparation. Often, the dramatic moments of revelation come only after we have prepared ourselves through simple, consistent devotional practices that align our whole being with spiritual receptivity. These visions weren't random hallucinations or mere products of an overactive imagination. They emerged from a soul that had been prepared through physical devotion. The rosary that Ignatius kept close during sleep had become a kind of spiritual conductor, creating pathways for divine communication that transcended his conscious religious knowledge. This pattern of physical preparation, leading to spiritual revelation, appears throughout religious history. Moses removed his shoes before approaching the burning bush. The disciples gathered in physical prayer before the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Teresa of Avila prescribed specific bodily postures to facilitate contemplative prayer. Across traditions and centuries, spiritual teachers have recognized what modern believers often forget, that our bodies and physical practices play an essential role in opening us to divine encounter. I'd like to pause for a moment here and ask you something important. Have you ever found yourself engaging in religious practices out of habit rather than devotion? Those moments when you pray, attend services, or perform religious rituals, but feel disconnected from their deeper meaning? I want you to know that you're not alone in this experience. Saint Ignatius himself went through periods where his spiritual practices felt empty before discovering how to transform them into gateways for profound encounter with God. If this resonates with you, I invite you to share it in the comments. You can simply write, "I seek deeper meaning in my practices," and if you feel comfortable, briefly tell us about your experience. Your comment could be exactly what someone else needs to read today to feel understood in their own faith journey. Sometimes the simple act of acknowledging our spiritual hunger begins to open the door to the nourishment our souls truly crave. The story of Ignatius sleeping with the Rosary teaches us something profound about the integration of physical practices and spiritual awakening. This integration stands at the heart of what would later become his most famous contribution to Christian spirituality, the spiritual exercises. In these exercises, Ignatius doesn't just engage the mind through abstract contemplation. He involves all the senses, encouraging practitioners to see, hear, smell, taste, and touch the scenes from Scripture they are meditating upon. This multisensory approach to prayer wasn't something Ignatius invented out of nowhere. It grew organically from his own experience of how physical objects and practices like keeping the Rosary with him even during sleep had prepared his whole being for divine encounter. Consider his famous meditation on the Nativity, where he instructs the practitioner, "See and consider the three divine persons, as though they were seated on the royal dais or throne of their divine majesty. See and consider Our Lady and the angel who addresses her. Reflect in order to draw profit from such a sight." He then continues by encouraging the meditator to hear the words spoken, to smell and taste the infinite fragrance and sweetness of the divinity, and even to touch through, kissing and embracing the places where such persons are. This fully embodied approach to spiritual practice emerged directly from Ignatius's own experience of how physical devotion, like sleeping with the Rosary, had opened him to transformative vision. This insight contradicts a common misconception that true spirituality must somehow transcend or escape physical reality. Throughout Christian history, there has been a recurring tendency toward a kind of spiritual dualism that views the body and physical world as obstacles to authentic spiritual experience. We see this in certain ascetic traditions that focus primarily on denying bodily needs and desires. We see it today in approaches to faith that reduce spirituality to intellectual assent to correct doctrines. But Ignatius discovered a more integrated path. For him, physical objects like the Rosary and physical practices like imaginative prayer weren't distractions from spiritual reality, they were doorways into it. This integrated spirituality stands in stark contrast to the compartmentalized approach that many contemporary believers have unconsciously adopted. We might attend church on Sunday but leave those religious sensibilities behind when we enter our workplace on Monday. We might pray before meals but approach the rest of our day as if God were absent from it. We might keep religious objects in our homes but fail to engage with them in ways that transform our awareness. Ignatius's practice of sleeping with the Rosary represents a different possibility, one where sacred objects and intentions permeate every aspect of our lives, creating continuous opportunities for divine encounter. Consider how revolutionary this approach would have been in Ignatius's time, and how countercultural it remains in ours. When Ignatius was recovering from his battle wounds, medieval Catholicism was heavily focused on external observances and hierarchical structures. Later, the Protestant Reformation would react against this by emphasizing personal faith and scriptural authority. But Ignatius charted a middle path that honored both the physical, sacramental dimensions of faith and the interior, personal encounter with God. This balance is symbolized perfectly in that image of the soldier turned saint sleeping with a rosary, allowing the physical beads to become a bridge between his unconscious mind and divine revelation. The late 15th and early 16th centuries, when Ignatius lived, were times of tremendous religious upheaval. Born in 1491, just 1 year before Columbus sailed to the Americas, he lived through the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which Martin Luther initiated in 1517. By the time Ignatius experienced his conversion and began developing his spiritual approach, the Christian world was fracturing along lines that would forever change the religious landscape of Europe and beyond. In this context, his integrated spirituality that honored both physical devotion and interior transformation offered a unique alternative to the polarizing tendencies of his time. The rosary that Ignatius kept with him during sleep became more than a personal devotional practice. It became a symbol of a distinctive spiritual path that would influence millions through the Jesuit order he would later found. The profound truth that Ignatius discovered, and that we would do well to recover, is that spiritual transformation often begins with small, physical practices that may initially seem insignificant. Sleeping with a rosary might appear to be a simple, even superstitious habit. But for Ignatius, it became the thread that connected his ordinary human experience to extraordinary divine encounter. This insight should challenge us to reconsider how we approach our own devotional objects and practices. That Bible on your shelf, that cross on your wall, that rosary in your drawer, these aren't mere religious accessories or decorative items. When engaged with intentionally, they can become instruments of profound spiritual formation. Think of the disciples who walked with Jesus during his earthly ministry. Their spiritual formation didn't happen primarily through abstract theological discussions. It happened through physical proximity to the embodied Christ as they ate together, walked dusty roads together, observed his interactions, and participated in his ministry. Their transformation came through embodied experience, not just intellectual understanding. In a similar way, Ignatius discovered that keeping the rosary close during sleep created a kind of physical proximity to sacred reality that prepared him for deeper spiritual insights. This pattern of embodied devotion leading to spiritual awakening is one that we can reclaim in our own faith journeys today. What makes Ignatius's approach to physical devotional practices so powerful is that he didn't stop at external observance. The rosary he kept with him during sleep became a gateway to the rich interior life he would develop, and eventually teach others through his spiritual exercises. In these exercises, Ignatius guides practitioners to use physical realities as starting points for deep interior work. For example, in his famous meditation on the two standards, participants are encouraged to vividly imagine two physical scenes: the chaotic, smoky battlefield of Satan and the peaceful, light-filled encampment of Christ. By engaging the senses in this imagination exercise, practitioners move from physical awareness to moral discernment and spiritual commitment. This pattern began with Ignatius's own experience of keeping the rosary with him as he slept. The physical beads became more than just an object, they became a bridge to his deeper unconscious, and, ultimately, to divine communication. This teaches us something crucial about spiritual practice. The exterior action, sleeping with the rosary, was valuable not as an end in itself, but as a gateway to interior transformation. In the same way, when we engage with devotional objects and practices today, their true value lies not in the external action alone, but in how that action prepares our whole being, body, mind, soul, and spirit for encounter with the living God. Another powerful aspect of Ignatius's experience with the Rosary was that it occurred during his sleep, when his conscious mind was at rest. This highlights an important dimension of spiritual formation that we often overlook. The work of God continues, even when we're not consciously engaged in religious activities. By keeping the Rosary with him during sleep, Ignatius was symbolically surrendering even his unconscious hours to divine influence. This practice foreshadowed what would later become a central principle of Ignatian spirituality: finding God in all things, at all times, even in those aspects of our experience that seem furthest from explicit religious activity. Ignatius's approach stands in stark contrast to two common extremes we see in contemporary spiritual life. On one hand, there's the approach that reduces faith to intellectual assent to correct doctrines without embodied practice. On the other hand, there's the approach that focuses on external religious activities without deep interior engagement. Ignatius showed a third way. Keeping the Rosary with him during sleep represented a physical practice that prepared him for profound interior awakening. This integration of exterior and interior, of physical and spiritual, remains one of his most important contributions to Christian spirituality. If we look at Ignatius's life before his conversion, we see a man driven by worldly ambitions. As a soldier, he was known for his vanity, his love of fine clothes, his desire for fame and glory in battle. Even his initial interest in religious matters during his recovery had a self-centered quality. He asked for religious texts mainly to relieve his boredom when the romantic novels he preferred weren't available. Yet something began to shift when he started keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. This simple physical practice began to create an opening in his consciousness, allowing for the possibility of transformation that would soon follow. The details of Ignatius's early life revealed just how dramatic his transformation would be. Born into a noble Basque family, he was raised to value military prowess and courtly manners. As a young man, he was known for his fighting skills, his quick temper, and his vanity. In his autobiography, dictated near the end of his life, he referred to himself in this period as a man given to the vanities of the world, whose chief delight consisted in martial exercises, with a great and vain desire of winning glory. There's even evidence that he was involved in criminal activities. As a young man, court records from 1515 suggest he was prosecuted for very enormous crimes. This was the man who, after beginning the practice of sleeping with the Rosary during his convalescence, would experience visions that would transform him into one of the most influential spiritual teachers in Christian history. This reminds us of an important truth about spiritual formation. It often begins not with dramatic revelations, but with small acts of devotion that gradually prepare us for deeper encounter. The soldier who casually kept a Rosary with him during sleep had no idea that this simple act was preparing him to become one of the most influential spiritual teachers in Christian history. In the same way, our seemingly small devotional practices today, keeping a Bible by our bedside, beginning the day with a brief prayer, wearing a cross as a reminder of our faith, may be preparing us for transformations we cannot yet imagine. Consider the gradual nature of Ignatius's conversion. It didn't happen in a single dramatic moment on the road to Damascus, as with St. Paul. Instead, it unfolded slowly during his months of recovery. First came the simple act of reading religious texts when no other books were available. Then came his observation of the different feelings that followed his fantasies of worldly glory, versus his contemplation of saintly lives. Then came the practice of keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. Only after these preparatory steps did he experience the visions that would definitively redirect his life. This pattern of gradual preparation followed by decisive transformation offers hope for our own spiritual journeys. The small devotional practices we engage in today may be preparing us for breakthroughs we can't yet foresee. What happened to Ignatius after those initial visions that were preceded by sleeping with the Rosary? The transformation was profound and lasting. He abandoned his military career and aristocratic privileges. He spent nearly a year in prayer and penance in a cave near Manresa, where he began developing what would become the spiritual exercises. He made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He studied theology in Paris, where he gathered the first companions who would form the Society of Jesus. Through it all, he maintained that integration of physical practice and spiritual awareness that had begun with the simple act of keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. After his recovery at Loyola, Ignatius gave away his fine clothes and donned a simple pilgrim's garment. He spent several months in a cave outside the town of Manresa, where he engaged in intense prayer, fasting, and other ascetical practices. During this time, He experienced both profound spiritual consolations and terrible desolations, including temptations to suicide. It was also during this period that he began writing what would eventually become the Spiritual Exercises, drawing directly from his own experience of how embodied devotional practices like sleeping with the Rosary had led to deeper spiritual awareness. From Manresa, he traveled as a pilgrim to Jerusalem, though his plans to remain there were thwarted when church authorities, concerned about his safety and possibly his unorthodox approach to faith, required him to return to Europe. Recognizing his need for education if he was to help others effectively, Ignatius then began a long period of study, first in Barcelona, then Alcalá, Salamanca, and finally Paris. It was in Paris that he gathered the companions who would join him in founding the Society of Jesus, including Francis Xavier, who would become one of the greatest missionaries in Christian history. This group took vows together in 1534, and the Jesuit order was formally approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. Through all these transformations, Ignatius maintained that integration of physical practice and spiritual awareness that had begun with the simple act of keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. This integration is beautifully expressed in one of Ignatius's most famous spiritual principles, finding God in all things. This phrase captures his conviction that the divine presence isn't confined to churches, religious ceremonies, or moments of mystical prayer. Rather, God can be encountered in every aspect of human experience, including the physical realities of our daily lives. The Rosary that Ignatius kept with him during sleep became a tangible reminder of this truth, that sacred and secular, physical and spiritual, conscious and unconscious are not separate realms, but interconnected dimensions of a unified reality in which God is always present and active. This perspective offers a powerful corrective to the compartmentalized way many of us approach faith today. We tend to divide our lives into separate categories: work, family, recreation, church, with spirituality confined primarily to Sunday mornings or designated prayer times. Ignatius invites us to a more integrated approach where physical objects like the Rosary can serve as bridges between these artificially separated domains of life. When we follow Ignatius's example, keeping sacred objects close to us throughout our daily activities and even during sleep, we begin to dissolve the barriers between religious time and ordinary time, creating the possibility for continuous awareness of God's presence in all circumstances. Think about how this integration might transform your own daily life. Perhaps you keep religious objects in designated spaces in your home: a Bible on a special shelf, a cross on a particular wall, a rosary in a drawer. What might change if you began carrying one of these sacred objects with you throughout your day, allowing it to accompany you in your work, your conversations, your moments of relaxation? How might this physical reminder of sacred reality gradually reshape your awareness, helping you to recognize divine presence in action in circumstances where you previously perceived only worldly concerns? This was the transformation that began for Ignatius when he started keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. The story of Ignatius sleeping with the Rosary also illuminates his understanding of what he called consolation and desolation in spiritual life. These terms describe different interior states that can either draw us toward God, consolation, or away from God, desolation. Interestingly, Ignatius recognized that physical practices and surroundings can significantly influence these interior states. By keeping the Rosary with him during sleep, he was creating an environment conducive to consolation, even in his unconscious hours. This insight reminds us that our physical spaces and practices aren't spiritually neutral. They can either support our spiritual growth or hinder it. In his Rules for Discernment, which form part of the Spiritual Exercises, Ignatius offers guidance for navigating these different spiritual states. He notes that in times of consolation, when we feel close to God and motivated in our faith, we should gather strength for the inevitable times of desolation that will follow. During desolation, when God seems distant and our faith feels dry, we should never make significant changes to our spiritual commitments, but should instead intensify our devotional practices. This wisdom emerged directly from Ignatius's own experience. During his convalescence, there were surely times when keeping the Rosary with him during sleep felt meaningless or routine. But by maintaining this physical practice even during spiritual dryness, he created the conditions for the consolation and revelation that would eventually transform his life. This awareness of the connection between physical environments and spiritual states informed the way Ignatius later structured the spiritual exercises. He was careful to consider not just the content of the meditations, but also the physical conditions under which they would be practiced: the time of day, the posture of the body, the lighting in the room, the duration of the prayer periods. All these physical factors were recognized as important influences on spiritual receptivity. This holistic approach began with his own experience of how keeping the Rosary with him during sleep had prepared him for divine encounter. For example, in the exercises, Ignatius provides specific instructions about bodily posture during prayer. I will stand for the space of an Our Father, a step or two in front of the place where I am going to meditate or contemplate, with my mind raised on high, considering how God our Lord beholds me. He offers guidance about the physical environment. I will add, according to the subject matter, appropriate penances, such as lying on the ground, or in a position that causes pain or discomfort. He even addresses practical matters like lighting. If it is in darkness, I will not desire to see. These detailed physical instructions reflect Ignatius's understanding that spiritual experience is deeply influenced by bodily conditions and practices, an insight that began with his experience of keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. In our modern context, this aspect of Ignatius's teaching has profound implications. Many of us live in environments saturated with distractions, digital devices constantly demanding our attention, advertising messages shaping our desires, scheduling pressures fragmenting our focus. Following Ignatius's example of sleeping with the Rosary might mean creating physical spaces and practices that counter these distracting influences and foster spiritual receptivity. It might mean designating certain areas of our homes as sacred spaces. It might mean establishing tech-free times and zones. It might mean keeping devotional objects visibly present in our living and working environments, not as mere decorations, but as tangible reminders of spiritual realities. Consider how different your spiritual life might be if you intentionally shaped your physical environment to support divine encounter. What if you replaced the television in your bedroom with a small altar containing a Bible, a cross, and perhaps a rosary? What if you established the practice of turning off all electronic devices an hour before sleep and spending that time in prayer or spiritual reading? What if you kept a sacred object like a rosary or prayer beads with you throughout your day, allowing its physical presence to remind you of divine reality even in the midst of worldly activities? These practices would echo Ignatius's approach of keeping the Rosary with him during sleep, allowing physical reality to serve as a gateway to spiritual awakening. One of the most powerful aspects of Ignatius's experience with the Rosary is that it occurred during a time of forced inactivity and suffering. The proud soldier who had been severely wounded in battle found himself confined to a bed for months of painful recovery. It was in this state of limitation and vulnerability that he began sleeping with the Rosary, preparing the way for visions that would transform his understanding of himself and his purpose. This reminds us that spiritual awakening often comes not when we're at the height of our powers and productivity, but in seasons of limitation, suffering, and apparent failure. This insight runs counter to many contemporary approaches to spirituality that emphasize personal empowerment and success. We often assume that spiritual growth happens primarily when we're actively pursuing it through disciplined programs of prayer, study, and service. But Ignatius's experience suggests that some of the most profound spiritual openings occur when our normal patterns of activity and control are disrupted. The wounded soldier confined to a sickbed didn't choose his circumstances, but he did choose how to respond to them. By keeping the Rosary with him even during sleep, he was saying yes to the possibility of divine communication in the midst of his limitations. Many of history's great spiritual awakenings have followed this pattern of limitation, leading to receptivity. The Apostle Paul received his transformative vision after being struck blind on the Damascus Road. John of the Cross wrote his most profound spiritual works while imprisoned by his fellow monks. Teresa of Avila experienced many of her mystical encounters during periods of illness. This recurring pattern suggests that there's something about the experience of limitation that can create unique openings for divine encounter. When our normal capacities and activities are restricted, spaces can open within us for a different kind of awareness, especially when we respond to these limitations with practices of devotion, as Ignatius did by keeping the Rosary with him during sleep. How might this perspective transform our approach to seasons of limitation in our own lives? Perhaps those times when illness, injury, financial setback, relational breakdown, or professional failure force us to pause our normal activities aren't just unfortunate interruptions to our spiritual journey. Perhaps, as with Ignatius, they can become unique opportunities for deeper spiritual receptivity, especially when we respond to them with simple devotional practices that keep us connected to sacred realities, even in the midst of suffering. The wounded soldier who began sleeping with a rosary during his convalescence couldn't have known where that simple practice would lead. He couldn't have foreseen that it would prepare him for visions that would redirect his life purpose. He couldn't have imagined that it would be the first step toward founding a religious order that would shape education, missionary work, and social justice initiatives around the world for centuries to come. In the same way, we can't predict what might flow from our own seemingly small devotional practices today. The Bible reading that becomes a daily habit, the prayer that begins each morning, the sacred object carried throughout the day, these may be preparing us for transformations and influences far beyond what we can currently envision. The story of Ignatius, sleeping with the rosary before his transformative visions, offers another important insight about spiritual formation. While the dramatic visionary experiences that followed were crucial turning points in his spiritual journey, they built upon the foundation of that simpler devotional practice. This pattern of gradual preparation followed by moments of breakthrough is common in the lives of many spiritual leaders and saints. Great revelations rarely come to unprepared hearts and minds. Instead, they typically come to those who have created space for them through consistent, often unspectacular spiritual practices. The details of Ignatius's visions are worth considering. During his convalescence, he reported seeing the Virgin Mary holding the infant Jesus. This vision wasn't a random occurrence or mere product of his imagination. It emerged from a soul that had been prepared through physical devotion, including the practice of sleeping with the rosary. The beads of the rosary, traditionally used to count prayers honoring Mary and meditating on the life of Christ, had created a tangible connection to the very figures who would appear to him in vision. This connection between physical devotion and spiritual revelation offers an important reminder about how God typically communicates with us, not through arbitrary or disconnected experiences, but through channels we have helped to prepare through our devotional practices. This understanding can help us approach our own spiritual lives with more patience and perspective. We may not experience dramatic visions like those granted to Ignatius, but we can engage in the same kind of preparatory practices he did. Keeping sacred objects like a rosary, a cross, or a Bible close to us throughout our daily activities, and even during sleep, can create an environment of spiritual receptivity. Reading spiritual texts, engaging in regular prayer, and participating in community worship can prepare our minds and hearts for deeper insights. These practices may seem ordinary, and their effects may be gradual, but over time, they can lead to profound transformation. What's particularly striking about Ignatius's story is the contrast between his pre-conversion and post-conversion lives. Before his spiritual awakening, he was driven by worldly ambitions, fame in battle, romantic conquests, advancement at court. After his conversion experience, which was prepared for by sleeping with the rosary, and culminated in transformative visions, he dedicated himself entirely to spiritual concerns and service to others. This dramatic shift illustrates the potential for radical personal transformation that exists within authentic spiritual practice. The same person who had once been consumed by vanity and ambition became the founder of a religious order known for its commitment to education, missionary work, and service to the poor. This transformative potential remains available to us today through the same integrated approach to faith that Ignatius discovered. When we allow sacred objects and practices to permeate our whole lives, not just our designated religious times, but our working hours, our family interactions, our recreational activities, and even our sleep, we create the conditions for profound personal change. The person who keeps a rosary or other devotional object close throughout the day and night is making a statement, whether consciously or unconsciously, about the priority of spiritual reality in their life. Over time, this commitment can reshape our desires, redirect our energies, and reorient our purpose, just as it did for Ignatius. In practical terms, how might we apply Ignatius's example of sleeping with the rosary to our own spiritual lives? The specific application will vary from person to person, but the underlying principle remains the same, allowing sacred objects and intentions to permeate even our unconscious hours. For some, this might literally mean keeping a rosary, a cross, or a Bible near their bed. For others, it might mean establishing a practice of prayer or spiritual reading immediately before sleep, allowing these sacred thoughts to influence their dreams, and unconscious processing. For still others, it might mean creating a home environment where sacred art, music, or symbols are consistently present, surrounding family members with reminders of spiritual reality, even as they go about ordinary activities. Consider how different aspects of Ignatius's spirituality can inform our approach to sacred objects and practices today. His emphasis on imaginative prayer invites us to engage with devotional objects, not just intellectually, but with all our senses. What would it be like to touch, taste, smell, hear, and see the realities that these objects represent? His teaching about finding God in all things encourages us to recognize divine presence and action even in seemingly mundane circumstances. How might keeping a sacred object with us throughout our daily activities help us maintain this awareness? His guidance about discernment of spirits challenges us to notice how different activities and environments affect our spiritual state. How might surrounding ourselves with sacred objects create conditions more conducive to consolation than desolation? The key insight from Ignatius's experience is that spiritual formation isn't primarily about adding more religious activities to our already busy schedules. Instead, it's about integrating spiritual awareness into every dimension of our lives, including those times when we're not consciously focused on religious matters. The soldier who kept the rosary with him during sleep wasn't setting aside special God time. He was allowing the sacred and the ordinary to interpenetrate, creating the conditions for profound revelation. This integrated approach to spirituality has significant implications for how we understand religious objects like the rosary. In some traditions, there's a concern that focusing too much on physical objects can lead to superstition or idolatry. In other traditions, there's a tendency to treat religious objects as mere symbols or teaching tools. But Ignatius's experience suggests a middle path. For him, the rosary wasn't an object of worship in itself, nor was it merely a symbolic reminder. Instead, it was a tangible point of connection between physical and spiritual realities, a bridge between his ordinary human experience and divine communication. This understanding aligns with the sacramental worldview that has deep roots in Christian tradition. From this perspective, physical realities aren't obstacles to spiritual experience but potential channels for it. The water of baptism, the bread and wine of communion, the oil of anointing, these aren't mere symbols, but efficacious signs that actually convey what they signify. In a similar way, devotional objects like the rosary can become authentic points of contact with divine reality when engaged with faith and intention. The sacramental worldview that Ignatius embodied stands in contrast to both excessive materialism and disembodied spiritualism. The materialist sees only the physical beads of the rosary and misses their spiritual significance. The disembodied spiritualist might acknowledge the symbolic meaning of the rosary, but fail to appreciate how its physical presence can create tangible connections to divine reality. Ignatius's approach, exemplified by sleeping with the rosary, honors both the material and spiritual dimensions of human experience, recognizing that God typically communicates with us not by bypassing physical reality, but by working through it. For Ignatius, this sacramental approach extended beyond official church sacraments to include seemingly ordinary actions and objects. His teaching about finding God in all things encourages us to approach every aspect of our lives, family meals, work responsibilities, natural beauty, artistic expressions, and even sleep as potential occasions for divine encounter. This perspective doesn't elevate ordinary things to the status of church sacraments, but it does recognize that all of creation can serve as a channel of God's presence and action when approached with appropriate awareness. This sacramental worldview has profound implications for contemporary believers. In a culture that increasingly treats spirituality as a purely private, interior matter, Ignatius's example reminds us that authentic faith engages with physical reality rather than escaping from it. In a society that often reduces religious objects to mere decorations or cultural artifacts, his practice of sleeping with the rosary challenges us to recover their power as tangible connections to divine reality. In a world that fragments our experience into separate domains of work, family, recreation, and religion, his integrated approach invites us to recognize God's presence and action in every aspect of our lives. When we understand Ignatius's approach in this way, sleeping with the rosary becomes much more than a quaint devotional habit. It becomes a profound expression of sacramental spirituality, recognizing that even our unconscious hours can be sanctified and that physical objects can serve as conduits of grace. This integrated vision offers a powerful alternative to the compartmentalized approach to faith that many of us have unconsciously adopted, where spirituality is confined to designated religious activities and the rest of life remains largely secular. The transformative power of Ignatius's approach becomes clear when we consider what followed his initial practice of sleeping with the Rosary. The visions he received during his convalescence were just the beginning of a spiritual journey that would produce extraordinary fruit. The spiritual exercises he developed have guided countless individuals into deeper relationship with God for nearly 5 centuries. The Society of Jesus he founded has educated millions, served the poor and marginalized around the world, and produced notable contributions to science, art, and culture. All of this flowed from a spiritual awakening that began with the simple act of keeping a rosary with him during sleep. This connection between seemingly small devotional practices and world-changing outcomes should challenge us to reconsider how we approach our own spiritual lives. We often want dramatic experiences and immediate results. We may be tempted to dismiss simple practices like keeping sacred objects close to us, establishing regular prayer times, or creating devotional spaces in our homes as too basic or unsophisticated. But Ignatius's story reminds us that spiritual transformation typically begins with these fundamental practices that gradually align our whole being with divine reality. The spiritual exercises that Ignatius developed after his conversion experience provide a systematic approach to the kind of integrated spirituality that began with his practice of sleeping with the Rosary. The exercises are typically undertaken during a 30-day retreat, though Ignatius also adapted them for people unable to withdraw from their normal responsibilities for such an extended period. They guide participants through a series of meditations on creation, sin, the life of Christ, and his passion and resurrection. Throughout these meditations, Ignatius encourages a fully embodied approach to prayer, engaging not just the intellect but also the imagination, emotions, and physical senses. This multisensory spirituality grew directly from his experience of how keeping the Rosary with him during sleep had created pathways for divine communication that transcended purely intellectual understanding. The impact of Ignatius's integrated spirituality extends far beyond his personal experience. Through the Society of Jesus, his approach to faith has influenced education, missionary work, social justice initiatives, and cultural engagement around the world. Jesuit schools and universities have educated generations of students in an approach to learning that seeks to integrate intellectual development with moral formation and spiritual growth. Jesuit missionaries have brought this integrated vision to diverse cultures, finding ways to honor local traditions while introducing Christian faith. Jesuit social justice advocates have worked to address systemic inequities, recognizing that spiritual transformation should lead to concrete action on behalf of the marginalized. The Society of Jesus that Ignatius founded has produced remarkable individuals who have carried forward his integrated approach to spirituality. Francis Xavier, one of Ignatius's first companions, became one of the greatest missionaries in Christian history, bringing the gospel to India, Japan, and the shores of China. Matteo Ricci demonstrated remarkable cultural sensitivity in his mission to China, adopting local customs and language while introducing Christian faith. Pedro Arrupe led the Jesuits during the challenging period following the Second Vatican Council and emphasized their commitment to faith that does justice. These and countless other Jesuits have embodied the integration of physical devotion and spiritual awareness that began with Ignatius's practice of sleeping with the Rosary. All of this began with a wounded soldier keeping a rosary with him as he slept. This seemingly insignificant act opened the door to visions that would redirect his life and, through him, influence countless others across centuries. It's a powerful reminder that spiritual impact often flows not from grand strategies or dramatic initiatives, but from simple practices of devotion that gradually transform individuals from the inside out. Do you feel that this message about Ignatius and his discovery of how physical devotion can lead to spiritual awakening has spoken to something in your heart? This channel is a refuge for souls seeking a deeper spiritual life like yours. By subscribing, we'll continue exploring together the teachings of the saints that can illuminate your path of faith. Each video is an invitation to remember the potential for profound encounter with God that lies hidden in the simple practices of devotion that we so often take for granted. I would be honored to accompany you on this spiritual journey, exploring the wisdom of saints like Ignatius, who have discovered pathways to authentic transformation. Thank you for dedicating this time to nourishing your soul. As we draw this exploration to a close, let's return to that image we began with: the wounded soldier, forced into inactivity, keeping a rosary with him as he slept. In that seemingly small act of devotion lay the seeds of a spiritual revolution that continues to bear fruit 5 centuries later. The profound truth that Ignatius discovered, and that can transform our spiritual lives today, is that authentic faith is neither purely intellectual nor merely ritualistic. It's an integrated reality that engages our whole being, our minds and our bodies, our conscious thoughts and our unconscious processes, our individual prayers and our communal practices. When we allow sacred objects and intentions to permeate every aspect of our lives, including those unconscious hours of sleep, we create an environment of spiritual receptivity. We break down the artificial barriers between sacred and secular, religious and ordinary, spiritual and physical. We open ourselves to the possibility of divine communication that can redirect our purpose and transform our character, just as it did for Ignatius. The rosary that Ignatius kept with him during sleep became a bridge between his ordinary human experience and extraordinary divine encounter. The devotional objects and practices we incorporate into our daily lives can serve the same purpose for us. That Bible on your nightstand, that cross on your wall, that prayer you whisper before sleep. These aren't mere religious accessories or routines. They are potential gateways to the same kind of transformative encounter with God that changed Ignatius from a vain, ambitious soldier into one of history's most influential spiritual teachers. The invitation that comes to us through Ignatius's example is both simple and profound. It's an invitation to integrate our faith into every dimension of our lives, allowing sacred objects and intentions to shape not just our designated religious activities, but our working hours, our family relationships, our creative pursuits, and even our sleep. It's an invitation to discover, as Ignatius did, that God can be found in all things when we approach life with the right kind of awareness. This integration isn't about adding more religious activities to our already busy schedules. It's about bringing spiritual awareness into everything we already do. It's about allowing sacred objects and practices to permeate even our unconscious hours, creating continuous opportunities for divine encounter. The soldier who kept the rosary with him during sleep wasn't setting aside special God time. He was allowing sacred reality to interpenetrate his ordinary human experience, creating pathways for revelation that would ultimately transform not just his individual life, but the spiritual landscape of the world. Perhaps the most encouraging aspect of Ignatius's story is that his spiritual awakening began in a time of limitation and apparent failure. The proud soldier who had been severely wounded in battle might have seen his convalescence as nothing more than an unfortunate interruption to his military career. Instead, by introducing a simple devotional practice into this season of limitation, he opened the door to a divine encounter that would transform not just his individual life, but the spiritual landscape of the world. In the same way, our own seasons of limitation, health challenges, financial setbacks, professional disappointments, relational struggles need not be merely unfortunate interruptions to our life plans. When we respond to these limitations as Ignatius did, by introducing or deepening simple practices of devotion, they can become unique opportunities for spiritual receptivity and transformation. The legacy of Ignatius reminds us that the most profound spiritual awakenings often begin not with dramatic revelations, but with simple acts of devotion, like keeping a rosary close during sleep. These seemingly small practices create an environment where our whole being can become gradually aligned with divine reality. And from that alignment can flow transformations we cannot yet imagine, changes in our character, redirections of our purpose, expansions of our influence that may continue to bear fruit long after our earthly journey has ended. As you reflect on this exploration of what Ignatius discovered before the visions that changed his life, I invite you to consider what simple devotional practice might open the door to deeper spiritual awakening in your own life. Perhaps it's keeping a sacred object near you throughout your day and night. Perhaps it's establishing a consistent time for prayer or spiritual reading. Perhaps it's creating a space in your home dedicated to reflection and worship. Whatever form it takes, remember that authentic spirituality engages not just your mind, but your whole being. Like Ignatius with his rosary, allow sacred objects and intentions to permeate every dimension of your life, creating pathways for divine encounter in even the most ordinary circumstances. If you found value in these reflections, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations of the wisdom that saints like Ignatius have to offer our spiritual journeys today.